yourself in a comfortable position and relax. The journey is about to start. We are in the Caribbean islands, a region situated between the two big American continents, North America and South America, also known as Latin America. We are going back to the roots of Afro-Cuban music, a fusion of Caribbean, African and European culture that became better known in the US as salsa music for advertising purposes in the 60s. Afro-Cuban music is a recipe with three main cultural ingredients: Taino culture, indigenous to the Caribbean islands; Spanish culture, European colonizers of the Caribbean islands; African culture, slaves brought to the Caribbean islands to replace the native Taino people after they were wiped out from their land. Here is a closer look at the Caribbean islands. As you can see, they are in the centre of where the sea meets the ocean. On one side is the Caribbean Sea, and on the other, the North Atlantic Ocean, as well as neighbouring coasts around the edges of North and South America. The native people of the Caribbean islands are referred to as the Arawak people. They consist of three main groups of indigenous: the Taino, the Guanahatabe, and Siboney. This culture is ancient, living very humble lives, appreciating and living off the fruits of the land. Fishing, hunting, and manufacturing to exchange with surrounding islands was part of their day-to-day. They celebrated life with social games and parties and practiced sacred rituals of divination to honour their gods. Little is known about the folkloric music of the Caribbean before the 1800s, but a couple of conclusions can still be made from early descriptions of the island's indigenous music and instruments, such as the maracas, a few kinds of flutes, jingles, and wooden drums. The wind or blow instruments were made from different materials like stones, bone, wood, and natural shapes like seashells and snails. Each instrument had its purpose in their lives, some just to play music during their parties or other celebrations. Others were used to call spirits during sacred ceremonies, and some were used to communicate over long distances. The Mayawakan slit drum is of primary importance among instruments for the Arawak people. It was used as a tool to communicate messages over long distances, as well as being used in sacred ceremonies. Tribe leaders used them to accompany songs to pass on stories of customs and laws to younger generations, and the Taino people played them with almost all of their songs. The drums were played with both normal sticks and rubber-ended mallets to help create a clear tonal quality. The drums had a multi-tonal range and could be heard from up to 6 to 8 kilometres. This was a perfect tool for the Arawak people to communicate with neighbouring villages. The drums were made from the trunks of thick trees, mostly oval in shape, and had an open slit or a H carved in the top so the sound could escape easily. The Spanish described them as having different shapes, some suspended by ropes between two poles or rubber footings as the base. This would have also allowed the sound to resonate and escape easily. The designs were different and varied by use, region, or perhaps maybe the personal choice or creativity of the builder or the musician who crafted it. Because they were sacred instruments and their music accompanied the sacred songs, It is not difficult to assume that the Tainos sculpted and painted the Mayawakans with their symbols of gods or their zemis. Like many sacred ceremonial tools or instruments in many indigenous cultures around the world, these instruments had to be cared for in special ways. The maraca, the rattle of divination, a sacred instrument used in traditional ceremonies and dance rituals by the Arawak people and many native tribes of North and South America. Still used today, every man had their maraca. Traditionally, native healers and shamans known as the curanderos use these rattles as a tool in their healing rituals to communicate with spirits and gods, to heal people and keep illness and bad spirits away. The rattles were made in many different ways. Some from gourds, with the dried seeds naturally falling inside to create the sound. Some were made from carved wood with a slit at the top that contained pebbles or a single stone. Some had carved wood handles with a calabash fruit mounted on top. This fruit would dry and the seeds would drop inside to make the sound. Others had a ball or a bladder made from sacrificed animal skin that was also mounted to a carved wooden handle and filled with seeds or thick sand. Old ceremonial maracas can be seen decorated with human hair and feathers and beads fastened to the top. The slit is said to represent a mouth, which their shamans made it utter its responses heard in sacred rituals. Modern maracas of today are made of different materials such as plastic, wood, and metal, often painted in beautiful designs and patterns. Guamo is translated to shell trumpet in the Taino language, and it was the shell of a lambi, a big oceanic snail. For centuries, the many people of numerous island cultures have blown into the conch shell as a form of communication. The guamo could be heard for long distances in the islands and had an important function in the community. Announcements would be delivered by a messenger whose specific task it was to know how to use the guamo properly in order to relay messages correctly. These messages would blow the guamo from peak to peak of mountain tops, from hill to valley, from ocean to shore, and vice versa. A form of communication that had been devised long before by the ancestors. Different sounds meant different things. Different pitches were used, short blasts or long blasts, constant or repetitive sounds, and each sound had a meaning that all the people understood. The flute was an instrument made of hollowed river reeds or bones, likely carved from birds like the condor. They had various hole patterns punctured through the shaft, which created different pitches and notes. It was traditionally played during village feasts, but was also played as a solo instrument. Dominican archaeologists have recently discovered some specimens of the decorated bone flutes in various excavations. It was hopeful that the reed flutes would also be discovered, but unfortunately nothing confirmed, as they would have not been preserved or survived the tropical climates. There were many other minor instruments discovered throughout the Arawak people. Various ocarinas, or types of whistles, were carved into the shapes of animals or creative sculptures as a way for the creator to honour their gods. They had 1 or 2 holes and were played like the flutes. Jingle snails, or olive snails, are made of snail shells strung around both male and female dancers. They would jingle happily with each step the dancers moved. Guiros or guiras, an instrument the Tainos crafted from hollowed out tree trunks or stone. They had grooves carved on one side and were played by scraping a piece of snail shell or bone or wood along the grooves in rhythmic patterns. The Aritos, a popular party to pass on history. It's a traditional ceremony of the Tainos people held over several hours or days to celebrate and honour their ancestors or gods, with native songs and dances performed as a means to pass on traditions and share knowledge with the next generation. What we know is that the Taino use music in all necessities of life, to make work more bearable, to celebrate special events, to communicate with their spiritual guides or zemis, to cure illnesses, to bring rain, or for protection against storms, cyclones and earthquakes from Mother Nature. They use music as a means of communication before they go hunting, on fishing expeditions and in warfare. In fact, music and song were so important that one of the most valuable gifts one Taino could offer another was a song. Fray Bartolomé de las Casas described the use of drums as a dance accompaniment, sometimes involving hundreds of dancers at a time. He wrote, "And on this island, what I could understand was their songs, which they called aritos, were their history passed on from person to person, fathers to son, from present to the future, as here uniting many Indians, passing 3 or 4 hours or more until the teacher or guide of the dance finished the history, and sometimes they went from one day to the next." The term arito is often used today to describe these events. This was the untouched version of how life was for the indigenous of the Caribbean. This was before Cristopher Columbus discovered their existence, and life as they knew it was changed forever.
We all know how Columbus came to the Americas with his 3 ships, but who did he find there? And how were the Spanish greeted? This is the story of the first contact between the Native American and the Spanish people, and what followed after. The Caribbean, 1492. On October 11, 1492, the Spanish were approaching the Bahamas from the northeast when they saw something interesting. Land was first seen by a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana. But Admiral Columbus, at 10 o'clock, saw a light, though he was uncertain that he could affirm it was land. Afterwards, Columbus claimed he saw the light once or twice more, like a wax candle rising and falling. It seemed to some to be an indication of land. Columbus had to make certain that land was close. Columbus asked and admonished the men to keep a good lookout on the forecastle and to watch well for land. He made a statement saying that a reward of a silk doublet, along with 10,000 maravedis promised by the sovereigns, would go to the first sailor to see land. At 2 hours after midnight, land was sighted at a distance of 2 leagues. Columbus ordered the 3 ships to halt and wait for daylight before going further. The next day, on October 12, 1492, after 2 months at sea, Columbus and his crew finally clearly spotted land. It's not known where they landed, but we can say for sure that they landed somewhere in the Bahamas. Having landed, they saw trees very green and fruits of diverse kinds. Upon reaching land, Columbus fell to his knees, thanked God for a safe voyage, and planted a flag in the ground. claiming the land for Spain, as the Tainos, who had lived there for 1,000 years, watched from behind trees and bushes. Shortly after landing, many of the island's inhabitants assembled on the beach. The Tainos gave them food and drink, gifts of parrots, cotton, and other goods. And the Spaniards gave them gifts of red hats and beads. The Taino people had never seen white men before and thought they were gods. Columbus spent the next 2 months looking for gold. In December of 1492, while they were sailing east of Cuba, 3 ships under the command of Columbus approached the second largest island in the Caribbean, which they later called La Española. Just when he was about to return to Spain on Christmas Eve, his ship, the Santa Maria, ran aground and sank. The Taino chief, Guacanagari, told his people to help the Spanish and retrieve every salvageable item. A problem arose when all the sailors who had accompanied Columbus could not fit on the 2 remaining and smaller ships. So a fort was built using the salvaged wood from the Santa Maria, and 39 men were left behind at a fort Columbus called La Navidad. Shortly after, Columbus set sail for Spain, taking some of the natives and birds, foods, and plants to show the king and queen. For the second voyage, Columbus was given a fleet of 17 ships and some soldiers. Upon arrival at La Navidad, Columbus found the fort burned to the ground, and all 39 men he had left behind had been killed. It seems the sailors left behind had misbehaved in the form of rape of the local women and theft of anything they saw that they wanted. One of the local leaders, named Caonabo, had met with the other leaders, and all but one agreed that gods would never have behaved in the manner that the Spaniards had, and they decided the Spaniards had to go, so they eliminated them and the threat they posed to their people. Columbus vowed to find Caonabo and retaliate. More fortified places were rapidly built, including a city founded on January 2, 1493, and named La Isabela for the queen. From that point on, life as the Taino knew it ended. The Spaniards took revenge for the destruction of the Fort La Navidad and also took slaves. Columbus forced the Tainos to work in the gold mines searching for gold. Those who refused were killed. Each adult over 14 years of age was expected to deliver a hawksbill full of gold every 3 months, or when this was lacking, 25 pounds of spun cotton. If this tribute was not brought, the Spanish cut off the hands of the Taino and left them to bleed to death. Taino women were given to Spaniards to do with whatever they wished. The fields, unattended, failed to yield enough food for the Tainos and the Spaniards, whose supplies had run out. All were hungry. Columbus found Caonabo, they tricked him in order to capture him, and he was put on a ship that was sent to Spain and was never heard from again. Many Tainos starved to death. Others died from hard labor. Many committed suicide. Epidemics swept the island. They were beaten, tortured, raped, enslaved, and murdered. After 1496, the number of Tainos fell by about 70%. Guacanagari, the chief who befriended Columbus, also died soon. At this point, the Spaniards in La Isabela started a rebellion against Columbus and his brothers. The Spanish king and queen sent a royal investigator to calm the situation. Columbus and his brothers were found guilty for numerous crimes against both the natives and the Spaniards. Columbus and his brothers were arrested and put on a ship to Spain. The Spanish authorities would allow him another voyage across the ocean, but they forbid him to visit La Española. He explored the Caribbean for 2 years and then returned to Spain, where he died in 1506. Meanwhile, on La Española, the Tainos who didn't want to work for the Spanish fled for the hills. The Tainos ruled in a mountain region. Their leader was a woman named Anacaona. She was the wife of Caonabo, the chief who had led the attack on the Spanish fort years earlier. In 1503, the Spanish governor requested a meeting with her in order to break the resistance. During the meeting of 80 Taino leaders, including Anacaona, the Spanish governor Nicolas de Ovando ordered the meeting house to be set on fire to burn them alive. Anacaona was arrested and accused of conspiracy for resisting occupation and executed. Prior to her execution, Anacaona was offered clemency if she would give herself to one of the Spaniards, which was common in the era. Standing with her fellow Tainos in solidarity, the Taino indigenous female leader chose execution over colluding with her Spanish enemy, her refusal creating her legend. Anacaona remained rebellious and independent until her violent public death. She was executed by hanging at the age of 29. Another Taino chief, Cotubana Mahuo, was ruling in another area, successfully resisting the Spaniards for a while, until he suffered the same fate as Anacaona. But there was one Taino who came to be known as the most resilient of all. His name was Enrique. He was also in the meeting when the Spaniards burned 80 Taino leaders. In fact, one of them was his father. Enrique managed to escape. After a Spaniard governor named Vanezuela raped his wife, Enrique started a revolt in 1519 with a large number of Tainos from the mountain range. He and his followers started a community in the mountains and set up a scouting network. Enrique instructed his men to fight only in self-defense, to kill Spaniards only in the course of battle, otherwise simply to deprive them of their arms. The Spaniards often attacked them, but the Tainos pushed them off time after time. During one battle, Vanezuela himself was captured, but even his life would be spared. Enrique ordered his release. The Tainos were able to continue the rebellion and waged guerrilla warfare on the Spaniards until 1533, because of their better knowledge of the region. As the Spaniards were not able to control the rebellion, Spain's monarch, Charles V, signed a treaty granting the Tainos the rights of freedom and possession. Enrique settled in the mountains with his 4,000 followers, the last members of the Taino culture. By this time, the native population was rapidly declining due to European diseases. At the end of the century, the Taino population was officially reported extinct.
The Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. To avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare. But the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
What we have just seen is a horrific page of history. The sadness and destruction that took place when these cultures encountered each other is devastating. We shared this with you today because we believe it is of fundamental importance to know the history and roots of the music you are studying. This is so you better understand the rhythms and notes you will be playing. They all connect and tell a story. The results of this cruelty and suffering was not only pain and destruction, it was also the beginning of something truly beautiful. Through strength and resilience, many cultures united together and fought for freedom and to preserve their history, culture, and beliefs, all through music. It was from here that Afro-Caribbean music was born.